All right, Anthony. So, in the first assignment that you had there, the last one, you took a look at the two images that really explain the differences in the North and the South. And of course, in the South, you had slave labor. And so, what I'm going to do briefly in this video is go through what life was like as a slave. We'll actually touch on this again some next week as well. But I want to give you kind of a briefer overview. So, you should have your notes out that say life in slavery, and you're going to be filling in the blanks that come up for you on the screen here. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, as a reminder, as I go through this, if you ever need to pause to make sure you get everything on the screen, please do so. All right, so first things first, there were really two major groups of slaves in, say, around the 1840s and 1850s in the South. You had your more city slaves, which were, and you'd find them more in places like Virginia, and obviously any of the big cities in the South. But one of those northern edges, you had a more city type of slave. And then in the deeper South, you had the rural slave. And the rural slave is what most people think of when they think of slavery. And this would be working out in the fields, things of that nature. Now, about 3/4 of the rural slaves worked from dawn to dark, so basically from sun up to sundown, but that was only their work in the fields. After it got dark, they also then had to go into other work, such as splitting firewood, carrying water from, maybe a well to the house or whatever it may be. They also had to feed the animals, all sorts of things. Now, slaves also had a number of other jobs besides working in the fields. There would have been seamstresses, blacksmith, carpenters. You also would have had a group of slaves in these areas called house slaves. They would have been your cooks. Basically just like the term would imply, they're working in the homes of their owners. Okay. And so this is just, this is a general overview of the working conditions. Okay. Now, what you have here is just a picture of the some slave quarters that have survived. These were built in about 1805. And a couple things to notice about this particular ones is you'll see they are actually off the ground. Not all slave quarters were built off the ground. This means that for many slaves, they had a dirt floor. These particular quarters are up off the ground, which means that when it would rain, for example, the water would be able to go under the building as opposed to just washing through it. Now these are also, they do have these happen to have like a little small front area here. These would have been very small buildings and would have been extremely crowded. Easily anywhere from 15 to 20 slaves per building would be living in here, and this would be anything from small children on up to your senior, your oldest slaves. Okay. So as far as the working conditions, the living conditions rather. So one thing to keep in mind about all of this is that anything that you see that's maybe good was not necessarily done out of compassion. You have to remember that slaves were considered property and like an investment in much the same way that today we would buy maybe a piece of equipment to mow the grass, buy a lawnmower, something like that. And so we want to keep that in good working condition. So we do certain things to take care of it. Well, this would have been a significant portion of the motivation for your slave owners as well. So for example, they seldom went hungry. They would have rations and cornmeal, bacon, molasses. You look back in that other picture, you can see an area where many would have had very small gardens that they would also be taken care of. They also had this cloth. It was called Negro cloth. It actually was it's a thicker, heavier type of cloth that they would have had as well. Now, many times they were given shoes, but the shoes just didn't fit. And so this is why you see any kind of images or pictures of slaves is that they would be barefoot because it was easier and better really for them to just go barefoot. As I mentioned to you before, they lived in very crowded conditions. Those very rough cabins you saw a picture just a moment ago. And interestingly enough, some slaves did receive better medical care than poor whites. Again, all of this has to do with, this is what's called a return on investment. Many slaves were bought and sold. They cost a significant amount of money for their owners, and their owners wanted to get the most that they could. And so they, to a certain extent, would take care of them. Some of them would see it as, maybe I paid this amount, but if they stay in good shape, I can sell it for a higher amount and make money, those kinds of things. Okay? So make sure, again, if you missed any of this, make sure you pause it before we move on. All right. So these two images really show, in many ways, some of the ways, the cruel ways that slaves were controlled. Now, take a look. I want you to look at this picture on the left and just think about some of the things you notice. I'll give you a moment to do that, and then I'll sort of start breaking down some of the things that are there and that I want you to make sure and notice. All right. So one of the things is to, in this left-hand picture, is to see, obviously you have the whip that's up here, but you see the slave here, and they are begging to not, what they're begging for is to not be separated from their child, which is right here on the right-hand side of the picture. The separation of the children from their parents was unfortunately all too common. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a moment and how impactful that was. But then you also have here this picture on the right, and this picture we'll take a look at more next week. But these are these bumps. These are actually scars from being whipped. Okay. So some of the ways that slaves were controlled were these very harsh punishments. There's stories, many stories of slaves just simply being whipped or beaten, having done nothing wrong even, just because. And this was a way of controlling the slaves, and it creates a tremendous amount of fear. There's a story that comes from, well, it's actually basically a book, and then it became a movie, 12 Years a Slave, and he talks about one of the things that this former slave talks about is how there was this woman who she got caught basically slipping away and avoiding her owner for several hours of a day, and so he finally catches her, and he has this other slave, Solomon, to whip her, and finally Solomon just can't do it anymore, and so then the slave owner does it himself, and this woman who had been a very strong woman was willing to, at least just slip away to get away from him for a few hours. Solomon talks about how she never disobeyed him again and was not the same woman. Obviously, after that, it took her weeks to recover from this. And this kind of thing was common throughout the South. You had particular people called slave breakers who were, their job were to break the will of the slaves. And they did this with violence, fear, all kinds of different tactics. Now, this is not to say that there were not forms of resistance to slavery. Okay. Now, you had this picture here actually shows of an actual slave rebellion, which we'll get to before we finish out the Civil War and things like that. But beyond that, though, there was a lot more of the almost passive aggressive in some ways. They would do things like pull down fences, they'd steal food, they'd break tools, they'd work tremendously slow. They'd even pretend to be dumb, sort of fitting into that stereotype story about that they aren't very intelligent. They pretend to be sick. even insane. They would also, some of them were a little more aggressive. We do have examples of slaves poisoning their masters, setting fire to their homes, things of this nature. And then, of course, you have some slaves that do get away. We have the folks like Frederick Douglass, for example, who runs away. We have Harriet Tubman, who's the leader on the Underground Railroad. She's an escaped slave who comes back to try to help others, and many others do. They do run away. And unfortunately, some of them get caught and sent back into slavery. And I can tell you, though, if they're caught and sent back, it was tremendously terrible punishment for them. They have their Achilles tendon, which is in the back of your foot, be ripped and torn. Severe other whippings and things of this nature. And this fear permeated all the slaves. And I think it's really difficult sometimes to understand this level of fear. And the question always becomes, why don't the slaves rise up? Why don't they do these things? And it really is this excessive amounts of fear that they have. All right, so this brings us to then slave communities and slave families. All right, so one thing to keep in mind is that the slave owners tried to dehumanize on a regular basis, to humanize the slaves. And one of the big ways that they did this is trying to basically not allow slaves to have semblance of family, a mom, dad, children, those kinds of things. And so slave communities, so slaves, adapted to this. Now, and sometimes you would have a much more what we consider traditional family, and they would be on certain plantations, they would stay together, but there was no guarantee of that. So slaves had to adapt because the family unit that is the basis of societal structures. And so if you can eliminate that, then you have broken down the society. Okay? So in this case, slave owners tried to break down and make them into individuals, destroy their sense of community, which is a source of strength, by breaking down their families. Now, so what was family life like? Well, first of all, you got to understand that American law did not protect enslaved families. There was no kinds of guarantees of keeping families together whatsoever. Now, this in turn then meant that at any time, a husband, a wife, or a child, they could be sold away at any time. Now, certain states did have laws that said you couldn't, for example, in Louisiana, you couldn't sell a child under the age of 12. But the reality is, slave owners lied all the time, or just simply ignored the law, and they would sell children away. They would sell the moms away, whatever it may be. And so this is breaking down the family for them. Now, to provide us a measure of stability, slaves established a network of relatives, friends. Everyone sort of became like this extended family. And again, this is all out of necessity. And so this is how, so if a child was sold from one plantation to another, there was a sense that they are part now of that community, and maybe you might have a mom figure or a father figure or something step in because they knew, everyone just sort of knew that needed to happen. Okay. All right. So one of the things that most people don't realize is that to a certain extent, and not as nearly as much as some people would like for others to believe, slaves did have some level of leisure activities. Okay. Now, what did this take and look like? Well, primarily this would have happened on Saturday nights and Sundays. They did have a lot of plantations, this time was theirs. Now, this has to do with the fact, this really comes from a concept of the Sabbath, or is the day of rest on Sundays. So nobody was doing anything on Sunday, so it wouldn't have done any good to say harvest a bunch of cotton because you couldn't do anything with it on Sundays. You couldn't sell it anywhere, that kind of thing. So This would lead to social events such as corn husking, pea shelling, quilting bees. They had dancing, and on Sundays, many plantations they would have an actual slave church. Some slaves would even be able to do a small amount of hunting or fishing, playing games, telling stories, visiting with other slaves, and naming babies was an actual community-wide activity. And the reason why this becomes a community activity is because of that. Again, this comes back to a necessity of um, families being the entire community. Now, you also had certain states, certain areas where it was illegal for slaves to name children after themselves. Again, the law there is just once again trying to break the families apart. So the slaves reacted and saying, well, that's okay. If that's the way we're going to be, then we're going to do this as a community. So that way, in particular, if, say, mom or dad are sold somewhere else, the child remains, they still have a network of family there where they're still at. And here is just very quickly a picture of a slave church, what's left of it. Now, again, not every plantation would have had a slave church. And in particular, um, so now, African American Christianity. So Christianity takes on a little bit different look in the slave community. So first of all, it became a religion of hope and resistance. Now, much of this comes from this idea from the Israelites, who, as you know, were in Egypt for 400 years, and they were slaves. And they cried out to God for generation after generation after generation, wanting to be released, wanting to be set free. And of course, the slaves really latched onto this, and that gave them a sense of hope that maybe they too someday would be set free. Now, you see this also coming out in what's called Negro spirituals, or you'll see here, I know it says spirituals here, but the term is Negro spirituals, and these were folk songs. They used them in some really impressive ways. One of which is to communicate secretly among themselves. So these songs were not just songs of talking about hope and of someday being free or Moses, but they would also sing the songs in such a way they would, talk about if they were going to have a meeting that night, they would communicate that, and these would be sung throughout the fields. They also used songs to explain where the directions were for the Underground Railroad, where the stops were, things like this. Okay, and this was common throughout the South to use of these songs for this purpose. So they really have a dual purpose. I mean, again, they are songs. They are that sort of hymn of talking about and providing hope in the midst of having to work out in the field. They're singing a song of hope, of being released. And at the same time, many of these songs, again, they're a way to communicate things to where their owners don't know. All right, and so one of the things you will start to see, too, is if you were to really look at the slave culture, is how it does blend some traditional African elements along with more traditional, at the time, American culture as well. The truly get blended within slave culture. Now, the way this process would have worked is that before 1808, you still had a stream of new slaves coming from Africa. Not a ton. In fact, most African slaves that came directly from Africa did not go to the United States. They actually would have gone to other parts of the world. But in 1808, Congress outlawed the slave trade. And so this cuts as far as new slaves coming in. So the result of this is that by 1860, which is right before the outbreak of the Civil War, almost all the slaves in the South had been born there. So what this means is now that the culture is adapting more and more, and in many ways is becoming more and more reflective of American culture at the time. Okay? However, that blending still happened. Many of the slaves had accepted Christianity, but they also followed and integrated some of the religious beliefs and practices of their African ancestors. So there is definitely a blending that goes on throughout this time period. All right, Anthony. So that gives you a very brief overview of what life was like as a slave. Definitely, if there's anything you missed in those notes, make sure you go back. And in the next week, we'll definitely be taking a look at some more, some different images and different things.